Rambam, the teachings of Maimonides. Today we begin. We're doing the third of the three chapters. We're going to do the third chapter today, but not the first one. It's the laws of the red heifer, which are laws that are, following the previous section, that were laws about the impurity that a person gets or becomes impure by coming into contact with a corpse, with a human corpse, whether you touched it, whether you carried it, even not touching it, whether you're in the same structure, right, and same covering, tent-like structure that covers you, and you're in the same structure, and all those details we just dealt with. And now we go into how do we cleanse ourselves from it. That's the laws of the red heifer. How we become cleansed, atoned from coming in contact with a corpse, right? So let's get right to it. Laws of the red heifer. Chapter 1. They're included two positive commandments. They are the laws of the red heifer, the laws of impurity brought about by the water used for the sprinkling of its ashes. Okay, we'll see these bits explained in the ensuing chapters. So, halacha number 1. The commandment involving the red heifer is to offer such an animal in its third or fourth year of life. If it is older, it is acceptable, but we do not wait for it to age any longer, lest its hairs become black, right? It's a red heifer, as we will learn. If it has two black hairs, it's invalid, right? So you don't want to wait, right? You don't want to wait to a time that it might change, but it is in its third or fourth year, right? Diane, if you can let in. Thanks. Okay. So the Jewish community does not purchase a calf and raise it, for it states, and ye shall take for yourselves a heifer, not a calf. If only a calf was found, a price is established for it, and it should remain with the owner's possession until it matures and becomes a cow. It should be purchased with the money from the temple treasury. So it's not a personal thing. It's something that is, collective for the entire nation. So it should come from the temple treasury, the money. And the verse says that you should take a heifer. So it means you could purchase it while it's a calf, but leave it in the possession of the owner, right? And then physically take it once it becomes a heifer and not a calf. Okay? Halacha number 2. The Torah's description of this heifer as perfect means perfectly red, not perfect in stature. Even if it was dwarf size, it is acceptable, as is the law regarding other sacrifices. If it had two white hairs or black hairs growing from one follicle or from two cavities, and they are lying on top of each other, it is unacceptable. That's all called perfect. It's got to be perfectly red. So if it had one, it's okay. Yeah, we're good? Halacha number 3. If there were two hairs, their roots reddish and their heads blackish, or the roots blackish and their heads reddish, their status follows the roots entirely. So we go by the roots, right? Why? Because that's what it is naturally, by the roots, right? Because what can happen is being outside the sun, as we know, someone who is dirty blonde, in summertime they become blonder, right? Right? That's not then the natural color. So we're talking about the natural color we have to go by. Okay? One should not cut off the blackish head with scissors. He need not be concerned about the prohibition against shearing consecrated animals because his intention is not to shear. I'm saying one should cut off the blackish heads with scissors, right? Remember, not the roots, but the blackish head, because you're not supposed to. There's a prohibition against shearing consecrated animals because an animal that's consecrated belongs to temple treasury, belongs to God, doesn't belong to the person, so you can't have benefit from it. Cutting off hair, that normally would be benefit, but in this instance, it's not because you're not doing it to shear. So therefore, it's not a problem. Okay? Enough red hair must remain so that it can be pulled out by tweezers. For if the hair is not large enough to be pulled out by tweezers, it's considered as if it does not exist. Okay? That's why don't cut it down to the very bottom. Sorry. Therefore, if two white or black hairs are so small that they can't be pulled out by tweezers, it is acceptable. Okay. If the horns, number 5, if the horns and the hooves are black, they may be cut off and it's acceptable. If the color of the eyeballs and the teeth, the tongue, the color of the eyeballs rather in the teeth and the tongues do not disqualify the heifer. Doesn't mean here the hooves to cut off because then you blemish the animal. So it doesn't mean that. It means, around it there's hair. That's what it means. Okay. If it had an abnormal growth of another color and one cut it off, even though the red hair grew in its place, it is unacceptable. So Ravid explains that the hair that will grow in its place will never be fully red. Okay? Excuse me. Give me a moment. Number 7. All the physical blemishes disqualify sacrificial animals also disqualify red heifer from proof text cited above states which does not possess a blemish. Right? It says not possess. So the same blemishes. So if like it had a lip that was slit or an eyelid that was slit or a leg that was something wrong, I think broken, if I'm not mistaken, if I recall. All those things. If the heifer was born by cesarean section, was exchanged for a dog, was present given by a prostitute, was trafe, these are all different possibilities, right? Or had been sodomized, it is unacceptable, right? All those things make it unacceptable, right? Just because that's similar with any sacrifice, right? Makes it unacceptable for this too. For any factor that invalidates a sacrificial animal for the altar invalidates a red heifer, even though it is considered only as consecrated for the upkeep of the temple, for scripture has called it a sin offering. So let's understand, right? That which goes on the altar, this is not going on the altar, this animal, right? It's actually, we're going to learn, it's going to be burnt and the ashes are put into water, right? It's going to be slaughtered and burnt. Not on the altar, though. Outside, we're going to learn it's going to be outside of the Beis Hamikdash, right? So, in a sense, it's not. it doesn't have the same on the altar. It's the altar of God, right? Yet all of these things invalidate because the Torah does call it a chatos, a sin offering, right? Although it's not really a sin offering, it's called that, but it isn't that in its essence, right? Because what is it doing? It's bringing purity to someone who became impure by coming in contact with a corpse. That's what it's being used for, this red heifer. Is that clear?
So it's for purification, not for atonement.
Torah calls it sin offering, so it has a quality of atonement too. It's really a cleansing, right? Inherently, it's cleansing, right? Of a spiritual, right? Blemish, if you will. Okay. It is permitted to purchase a red heifer from a non-Jew. We do not suspect that the non-Jew sodomized it, for it would not destroy the value of his animal. There is more severe element to the red heifer than the animals consecrated as sacrifices. What's that? Work disqualifies it. You're not allowed to work it. As this verse says, upon which a yoke was never placed. Now, concerning the calf whose neck is broken, it says, we just learned this, Parsha Shoftim, if you recall, that if there was a homicide outside of town, and you don't know who the killer is, so there's the law of the broken neck of the calf, right? That we learned a few weeks ago, right? So concerning that, which no work was performed and which was not led with a yoke, right? There it says very clearly. By the red heifer, it says that no yoke was placed on it. That's all it says. When it comes to the calf that was in the homicide case, right? There it says, which no work was performed and which is not led with a yoke. Now it's more descriptive, right? The yoke that led to work.
Yeah.
So just in regard to the yoke mentioned in connection with the calf, the Torah equated to labor with a yoke. So too with regard to the red heifer, other forms of labor also disqualify it, just like a yoke does. Right? Any labor that's done. Yoke is used to put on an animal. Why? For its labor that it's going to do. Right? Therefore, any type of labor will disqualify the red heifer to be used in the process of bringing purification. Is that clear? There is, however, a greater stringency that applies with regard to a yoke. A yoke disqualifies the heifer whether it was placed upon it during work or not during work. And other forms of labor disqualify only when work was actually performed. Yet the Torah specifies by the red heifer. So you might ask, why the red heifer? Why didn't we just say a yoke that work was done? It doesn't say that, it just says yoke. Because that's to bring out that other types of work is when you actually did the work, right? That disqualifies the red heifer. But when you put a yoke on and did no work, you just put the yoke on, that itself disqualifies it. That's why the Torah just says that, right? Why? It's irrelevant. The point is, that's why the Torah specifies only yoke and doesn't say yoke that labor was done with it, right?
Much more stringent.
So it's more stringent by the yoke as opposed to any other work. So what does it imply? If one tied a yoke upon it, it is disqualified even when it did not plow with it. Right? If one placed it in a threshing team, it is not disqualified unless it was actually threshed. Similar principles apply in an analogous situation. In other words, a threshing team doesn't have a yoke, I guess, but it's work, right? A bunch of animals together come and they do threshing. So you placed it there, ready to do it. You didn't do the work, so it's not disqualified. If you did the threshing with the red heifer, then it becomes disqualified. Okay, is that clear? If one rode upon it, leaned upon it, hung on its tail, crossed a river using it for support while swimming, folded its lead ropes on top of it, placing his garment on it, placing a covering of sacks on it, it is disqualified. Hear that? Because you used it for something. You benefited from it. You're not allowed to. I don't understand why that is so. You leaned on it. Why would that be in the qualification of work? Benefit, I get. But the verse didn't say benefit. The verse didn't say you can't benefit from it. The verse said, don't put a yoke on it. Right?
The slightest yoke. Because leaning on it is not heavy for it.
Right, but that was specific by yoke, we said. Why did the verse say yoke and not yoke for work? That even if you just put the yoke on it, that itself disqualifies, as opposed to threshing, which you don't put a yoke on. If you just got the animals together, you got a bunch of animals together to thresh, right? You just gathered them. That doesn't disqualify. It's only when they actually did the threshing that will disqualify them because they actually did the work, right? So how is leaning like the yoke? I'm not clear on that. Or when you took this animal and you crossed the river and you put things on it, right? Right? Your shirt, you didn't want to get away, you put it on top of it. That's called getting a benefit. That's called work. If one rode upon it, okay, we just did that, yeah. If one tied it up with a rope because it was rebellious and required to be safeguarded, it is acceptable. Because you're not doing it for any benefit or any work. You're just doing it because it's whatever. It's, acting wacky now, right? If not, it is disqualified. In other words, you did it for any safeguarding that is unnecessary is a burden. That's called a burden on the animal, and it disqualifies the animal. It's considered as a yoke. Yeah, a yoke is a burden, so maybe that's what it comes. When you're leaning on it, so it's a derivative of yoke, right? In other words, from yoke, there's two things. There's work, and then yoke being a burden. So it's two components, right? I know there's, you put something on us, right? You put a backpack on you. It doesn't matter if it's only 5 pounds, or even a pound. It's still a burden. Not a big burden, but still somewhat of a burden, right? It is a burden on you, right? You may not treat it as a burden, but it still is something on you that's right, extraneous to you that you have to carry now, right? So if you're leaning on it, that's the same idea. So that maybe ties in. I guess there's two components here to yoke. Yoke for work, yoke for burden. And the very fact you put it on as a yoke without the work, it itself is a burden. That itself disqualifies. Okay, this is a general principle. If anything is done for its own needs, it remains acceptable. Now, if you're doing it for the need of the animal, of the heifer, that's acceptable. If it's performed for any other purpose, it's disqualified. when work was performed with it as a matter of course, or a yoke was placed over it as a matter of course, if the owner is pleased, it's disqualified. The rationale, as the verse above says, which no work was performed. The implication is that if work was performed with it and the owner would be satisfied, it is that as if he performed work with it. Therefore, if a bird rested upon it, it is acceptable. If a male mounted it, it is unacceptable, because that's something you're happy. Needless to say, a pregnant heifer is unacceptable.
If it's done for any other reason than for its own good, it's disqualifying.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Needless to say, pregnant heifer is unacceptable. If one placed it among a team of animals and it threshed grain on its own accord, it remains acceptable. If he placed it among a team so that it would nurse and thresh, it is disqualified. For he is satisfied with the work that is performed. Similar laws apply in analogous situations. So you put it amongst a team of animals and it threshed on its own, right? It threshed on its own. That's acceptable. But if you place it there so it would nurse in the team and then thresh, so by nursing and then threshing, it disqualifies because you're satisfied with the work that was performed. In the first one, it threshed on its own. In this one, you kind of set it up that it should thresh, nurse, and then thresh. Then that's disqualified because you're satisfied with the work. Okay, I'm going to stop here.